Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at Christian intentional community again because it is such an important topic. We have with us Dr. Mark Killian, professor of sociology at Whitworth University and the author of Religious Vitality in Christian Intentional Communities, a Comparative Ethnographic Study. Dr. Killian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, so if we could start with just your own brief background related to your theology or your church tradition, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So I was raised in a mainline United Methodist church, but I had what I call a reaffiliation experience in high school through a parachurch ministry that really kind of brought me into evangelicalism. And so spiritually, I was, raised within this kind of the evangelical community. I went to college to participate in evangelical ministries and ended up after college planting churches. And it was during my second church plant experience that I started to see some things that didn't quite mesh up with my evangelical theology. And so I wanted to investigate this more, ended up in a PhD program in sociology, and really have a vision and a calling to use that education and the understanding of a social scientific study of religion to help churches to make churches more vital, which is really, really important given how churches are operating today and the recession in attendance and number of people adhering to Christian theology. I definitely come from a more reformed background. I'm currently part of a Presbyterian church in the town that I exist in. I am not officially an member because I don't want to be called into session. So I try to participate as much as I can without actually being a full member. But I feel very comfortable in a Presbyterian liturgy and within Reformed theology.
All right. And so your book is about not just intentional communities, but specifically religious vitality. So how would you define religious vitality?
Yeah, so I mean, the best way I describe it and how I describe it to churches is, we could think of vitality really in two ways. One, which often people think of vitality as, is growth, is people coming and joining a religious organization. However, I think that that's pretty limiting in terms of how we should think about vitality within congregations. There is growth, there is the joining. But there's also the staying. There are people who are committed to a congregation, to a church, to a community. And I think that staying often gets, lost in the mix when it comes to vitality. And so we have to think about not only the people who are joining, but the people who are staying, the individual commitment to a congregation, to a fellowship, to a community. So one of the ways that I kind of frame this is you can have church A and they could have 100 people in the first year, 200 people in year two, and then 101 people in year three, right? So their ultimate growth over 3 years is 1%. You could have another church, which is 100 people in year one, 101 people in year two, 101 people in year three. Their growth is still 1%, but there's probably a whole lot more commitment, a whole lot more staying in that second church than there is in that first church, right? So that staying, that commitment is also very much a large part of vitality.
And then how do you define intentional Christian community? And if you could distinguish the difference between congregational and non-congregational communities.
Yeah, so I mean, in the book, I give a very academic definition. I think I say it's a group of 3 or more people who, some of whom are unrelated by blood, who gather in a single household or related set of households, And here's the important part when you talk about Christian intentional communities. And these individuals who are gathered together, they attempt to engage in orthodox Christian theological values that aren't available either at society in large or within long established Christian traditions. And so the idea here is you have the very intentional connection in space, a household or set of households. And you have, it's not just a family, right? You have unrelated blood. But more importantly, that these intentional Christian communities are really what we consider within the sociology of religion sects, sects,
Right.
that are breaking away or finding new ways of faith expression that again aren't either available in society in large or aren't available in longstanding traditions. So that's the difference between like a congregation, which a typically doesn't have that typical space element that they're living in a household or interconnected sets of households, and two that might not have that breaking away from the long tradition. So the intentionality, that's the key part. It's not just Christian community. Lots of churches have Christian community, but it's intentional breaking away. It's intentional living together. And there's this geographic element that's a big part of the equation.
And then you briefly review the history of intentional communities. There's
Yeah.
been centuries of various experiments. So if you could go over those briefly, and also what you consider the five waves of Christian intentional communities here in the United States.
Yeah. So definitely, there's a long history. I mean, this goes back to the Qumran, right, in ancient Israel, and you have various uh, the Desert Father sects that were breaking off of the early church and finding communities within Egypt and within the Middle East. And so you have this long history within, and this is debatable, but kind of within the United States, how I see it is that there have been these five waves. Now, when I talk about a wave, what I'm talking about is that you see this tremendous growth of intentional community formation with also tremendous recession. So there's a big spike, and then all of a sudden the communities don't. Many of the communities don't survive. There have been communities that do survive. So, for example, going back into the United States history, you have a number of intentional communities that formed around the beginning of the United States. And these are what I call the colonial communities. The Shakers being the kind of the quintessential Christian intentional community that was formed at that time. And the Shakers, really existed. I think the last Shaker actually died in the mid 20th century, or even later. I don't know, but definitely they were part of a number of different communities that popped up. A lot of them either institutionalized into congregations or they died out. And so you have that colonial intentional community wave, and then you have kind of this wave in the 19th century that corresponds with manifest destiny. And you have a number of communities that tangentially might have been Christian or took Christian traditions with them. So this includes like the Oneida community, which was what we consider a non-monogamous community. A polyamorous community, Amana, which is I think the community of true inspiration, and so these were communities that were popping up in the mid to late 19th century as the United States was expanding west. And then in the early 20th century, you see another increase of another wave of intentional community formation, particularly around industrialization. So Zion City, which was a intentional community that was formed north of Chicago. And it was a planned community as well. And you have a lot of these planned communities, or within urban planning, we call them garden cities. But this Zion City was a little bit different in that it was architecturally planned. It was, in terms of the actual neighborhood, it was planned out, but it also had this religious element, this Christian element to it, and was fairly hierarchical. But that was very much in response to industrialization in Chicago at that time. So you have a number of communities form at that point. And then the counterculture, which I think for many people today, we kind of get our intentional community understanding from the countercultural movements and Christian intentional communities that formed out of the counterculture. The one that I'm most familiar with that still exists today is JPUSA, which stands for Jesus People USA. That's also in Chicago. But it was interesting interviewing individuals who had been part of the Jesus People movement, that countercultural movement, and hearing about how they would bounce around to different intentional communities, and they all had very similar worldviews and perspectives, particularly around the end times. And so the idea was, for many of those communities, a lot of these don't exist anymore, but for many of them, it was, hey, why own everything? Let's share everything in common because Jesus is coming back tomorrow. And so they were highly evangelistic as well, because they would go out and find somebody who was strung out, part of the countercultural movement, and say, hey, look, here's the deal. Jesus is coming back tomorrow. You got to get clean. Just sell all your stuff and come live with us because we're sharing it all together. So that was another wave. And the fifth wave that I talk about, that I try to capture in my book, is what I really argue is a wave that happened in the early 2000s and into 2000, really up to 2015. A lot of those communities have disappeared. Some still survive, but a lot of them have disappeared. This latest wave of community formation, I think, can best be exemplified by the Simple Way. Shane Claiborne in Philadelphia, that you had connections with Sojourners, which was a community that was formed, in that countercultural wave. So there are a lot of communities that popped up in that simple way style. But again, a lot of them have disbanded since then. The two that I, visit and do research in with my book, they're both operating still, albeit one has had a lot of turnover, and I'll talk about Philadelphia later, but the other one has been pretty consistent, and that's the community Berea. But it's important to understand kind of that these waves often evolve around social change, dramatic social change, right? So creation of a nation, manifest destiny, industrialization, countercultural revolution, and then you have more recently globalization. So I think that's something that I would hypothesize is correlated, and I think other people will see in the future when we have more social change. Again, another wave of intentional community formation occurring.
So perhaps intentional communities are becoming more doctrinally sound over the years. A lot of those earlier ones weren't quite orthodox.
Yeah.
So what would you say then is the biblical basis for these intentional communities?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the biblical basis comes from the book of Acts, and in particular, really the first 6 chapters up until the calling of the deacons. Acts 4, in particular, that describes everyone meeting together and sharing everything in common. The story of Ananias and Sapphira of the field, and they didn't sell the field to support the community, and yeah, that didn't turn out well for them. But those are some of that biblical basis of really going back to um, a view of the first century church as having everything in common, as people living together, gathering today figuratively in the upper room to eat and to share material and to share faith, right? Now, what's interesting, of course, is most intentional communities don't place Acts 4 within a highly persecuted environment where the Romans were coming after all the Jesus followers. And so consequently, yeah, they had to kind of group together. And you have, the widows who are taken care of in Acts 6 because you know the men were dying, the men were being persecuted, the men were being put in prison. So that part tends to get lost for intentional communities, but definitely it's that that vision of the first century church after the resurrection of Christ.
And you've touched on this already, but what would you say are the essential components of Christian intentional communities?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that one of the clear things is that they are finding something different, a way of life, a way of being that is different from society. So in this way, they're very countercultural, throughout time as well as the communities I studied here in the book. But also that they can't find in, again, that longstanding Christian tradition. So you think about the communities I visited, and one was started by two at the time. I think when they first started, I mean, they were late teens, maybe they had hit early 20s, but they came out of an evangelical church youth group, started their own Bible study, and they were really seeking out that Acts 4 vision, being together, living together, um, and they couldn't find that in other places. They couldn't find that in the church that they had uh, participated uh, had participated in, and so they were looking for something very new, and they found support through other means, which I can go into, but. I mean, I think that's kind of the key thing. One thing to understand, though, is when we talk about Christian intentional communities, there is still an orthodoxy that these aren't necessarily, as you mentioned, with some of the like Oneida, right, which kind of went off of Christian orthodoxy, it didn't match with Christian orthodoxy. A lot of the communities that were established within the early 2000s, early 21st century, they were very much Christian Orthodox. Now, they spanned different theologies and different perspectives, but very much committed to a theology that's based on the Trinity, theology that recognizes the resurrection of Jesus, and followed, to the best of their interpretation, what we'd consider Orthodox theological principles.
So those some of the strengths then you're talking about. What are some of the core weaknesses that seem to keep popping up over and over again in
Yeah.
Christian intentional communities?
Yeah, so there's a reason why these communities will pop up and then a lot of them will die off pretty quickly. I mean, within 4 years. The biggest thing is that they are countercultural. Living in an intentional community is you sacrifice privacy. It's a very public life, and you are constantly being watched. Now, some people do fine in that. Others have a hard time operating where you can't find any sort of privacy. And even if, and again, we'll get into kind of the variations of intentional communities, but even if you have a community that doesn't live in one household, but maybe has multiple sets of households, and they have private property, but they live within 3 blocks of each other, right? That's still very, very public life. And so an example is when I would do interviews with both communities, I always had to interview female participants in public spaces. Because even if I were to go to, let's say, Berea, which they lived in a many different households, with most of them within 3 blocks. The question is, oh, why is Mark going into so and so's house? Right? It's a very public life, and so I think that's the biggest thing that intentional communities struggle with. The other thing is just, it's novel because it's something that you can't find anywhere else. It's like, oh, this is a great idea, right? We're following Acts 4, we're living out the first century vision, and then you get into it and you're like, oh, this is what it is. And you have all these personality conflicts and who does what in this, who cleans and who doesn't, and so that could be a problem as well. So very practical things that make intentional community living hard. The long-standing communities have figured it out. They know how to operate and they have adjusted, but that takes time. That takes time, and it's the exception more than it is the rule.
Right, and we'll get more later into authority and the issue of control, which is a big factor.
Yeah.
So what would you say, you're looking at the causes of religious vitality. So what makes churches and Christian communities thrive? And in particular, you have a way of looking at it through structural, organizational, and individual explanations for religious vitality. So how do you see that?
Yeah, so within the sociology of religion, really the social science of religion, there's lots of questions about what gives religious organizations vitality. Either people joining, people staying. And, from my perspective, and I'll go into a little bit, if you don't mind, Dennis, about my own church planting history. My second church plant was, in my estimation, kind of unexplainable. We went from 20 to 900 in 2 years. And at the time, again, coming from this kind of evangelical perspective, I was thinking, oh, this is the Holy Spirit at work. Right? This is what I prayed for, and this is, obviously we're being blessed here. But at the same time, I also knew what I and the other two planters were doing behind the scenes, which is not something that I would say was righteous. We were not thinking in terms of the kingdom. We were thinking in terms of ourselves, and we were being pretty crude, frankly, about how we were going about this. We were not. It just wasn't a prayerful, humble work behind the scenes. It was very much an aggressive strategy that we had to, frankly, steal people from the other mega churches around us. And so there was a point where we had, me and the other two guys had a big explosion, and I felt really convicted of what we were doing, but it didn't quite jive in my evangelical mind of, hey, you get good only because you do good. We weren't doing good, but we were getting good, right? And so I left that experience going, what happened, right? I don't quite understand what was going on because it didn't mesh with other things that I had received and had experienced in my past. And that's what drew me into the literature in sociology of religion, was to say, hey, there are these social scientific explanations for religious vitality. And a lot of churches have a hard time thinking about this, right? They want to say that it's the work of the Holy Spirit. And in some cases, it is the work of the Holy Spirit. There are some cases where we cannot explain the growth, either the commitment or the joining, through simple scientific means. But the way I tend to frame it, and this meshes, I think, well with my theology, is that there's an order to creation. And, churches exist in terms of their vitality, exist on a spectrum, and there's a bell curve. And definitely there are cases where you just cannot explain the growth, and those are the Holy Spirit blessings. But there are many cases where it seems as though you can explain the growth through these scientific theories, social scientific theories. And as I look back at my church experience, my church planting experience, these theories definitely applied. I could see the relevance of these theories within my own experience. Now, what I try to do in the book is not necessarily introduce any theories, or introduce a new theory, but really try to moderate the discussion between all the different theories that are out there. And there are some theories that are more applicable, that apply better in some situations, and there are some theories that don't apply. But definitely, if you look at churches and think about vitality in churches, these theories are working off of one another to help explain how churches are have vitality and can be vital once again if they feel as though they're not. So there's a list. I can go through the different lists, but I think there's some questions you'll have for that.
Well, okay, so if you could just go over the big three then, the organizational, structural, and
Yeah.
individual, how those work together.
Yeah, so there's kind of these three different levels of analysis, right? So actually, I'll start with the structural. So the structural is how religions sit within a society's social structure. So how Christian churches and congregations and communities exist within the United States social structure. One of the things that when I talk with churches, I have to address is if you want to really grow your church, have more kids. Fertility is the number one statistical factor of church growth. And churches that grow have, on average, at least one more child compared to the national fertility rate compared to churches that don't grow. So, an example is in the late 20th century, the Southern Baptist Convention, on average, had 3 children per family, whereas Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and United Methodists had less than 2. So what
Yeah,
happened
yeah.
over that last 20th century? Southern Baptist Convention grew, right? And those mainline denominations shrunk. What's interesting is that the evangelical fertility rate just within the past decade has dropped below 2 now. So, my I would never I don't bet, so I would never place money on this, but what my prediction is that 20 years from now, that same type of recession in evangelical churches will occur because simply there's just not enough kids replacing the current evangelical population. So that's a structural. It's like that's something that we can think of as existing above churches, existing above communities. Organizationally, churches exist within an economy. And I know when I say this, churches hate this, right? Because they don't want to think of themselves as a business. But in some ways, churches are the ultimate sharing economy, right? There isn't charge. I don't know many churches that charge for people to come on a Sunday morning, right? But they ask that you share your resources. And so it's very much part of that sharing economy. Consequently, church organizations and religious organizations do have to think about religious goods and religious services. What are we providing to potential customers? And those churches that have had that numeric growth, that joining vitality, they often have religious goods and services that are culturally appropriated and sell really well. Those who have the vitality of staying tend not to engage in that. Hey, I'm going to compete for these different constituencies. I have my church; they're vital, but they're still offering a religious good and service that keeps people there, right? That no matter even if they're not engaging in the economy, they're still providing religious goods and services based off of their culture, based off of that includes like worship style. based off of their ideology, um, that keeps people there. And so that's important to understand. So that's kind of organizationally. And then individually, if we kind of go down to the individual level, people are trying to find what the literature calls individuated expressions of religion, that they want a type of faith, whether it's Christian faith or non-Christian faith or spirituality, that very much satisfies themselves. And so they will go and seek that out. And sometimes that involves being part of a community. Sometimes that doesn't. And this is where we get into that conversation of the religious nuns, NONES, which is a very, the segment of religious people that is growing the most within the United States.
Right.
And they will very much identify, for the most part, this is not including agnostics and atheists. They will identify, the religious nuns will identify as being religious. They will participate in religious practices such as prayer, scripture reading. They will have said that they have been part of a religious community in the past, but they are no longer affiliated with a religious community. And so we have the nuns, right, which is very individuated religious experience. And then from that, there's another segment that my friend Josh Packer has looked at called the religious duns, which are people who, very much like me, maybe had an experience in an evangelical church or parachurch ministry, very much was committed, maybe even in ministry themselves, but find themselves alienated and having no place to go, and realize, you know what, I could do this by myself. And so very much kind of focused on that individuated faith. And so we have all these things kind of working together. And my argument is there's really no chicken or egg here, which is always a problem when we think about, like, what's the origin, what's the ontology of all this. But then it's very much what I call structurated, which is these things are happening reciprocal, simultaneous, and it's better for us to identify that these things are all, bouncing off of each other, rather than separating one out and isolating that one, saying, okay, we got to work on this thing.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. And then so much of what draws people to intentional communities is their view of the world. So can you talk about the relationship to the world, the greater society, greater church also, in view of the spirit of alienation, or theme of alienation that you talk about?
Yeah. So that was something that definitely I knew, based on previous literature, that was something that I would probably bump into when doing this research, and talking to the individuals who were joining the communities that I was studying. And it came true that many of these individuals felt alienated. Now, what do I mean by alienated? Well, really, there's kind of different forms of alienation. Benjamin Zablocki, who studied communities in that countercultural wave, talked about this hierarchy. I'm not sure if there's a hierarchy, but there are different forms that are very much present. And I'll go briefly kind of over these forms. There's the sense of meaninglessness. I'm part of a church, but this doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know. I'm searching for something with meaning, even though I'm part of this church. There's a sense of aimlessness. I don't know where this church is going. I don't know if I want to be part of a church that doesn't seem like they're going anywhere. There's powerlessness. This church is so huge. I don't see myself really getting into leadership at all. There's normlessness, which can be often the most devastating, because that's where we start to see deviance occur, which is, I don't know how I'm supposed to be in this church, or even in society at large. I don't know how I'm supposed to act in society at large. I can get confused. Can I say this? Can I not say this? Can I do this? Can I not do that? And then there's this self-estrangement. And so what I found with self-estrangement is just simply people get detached, right? They'll show up physically, but they're completely detached, not only from the church or the society, but from themselves. They feel like there's some like their soul is ripped out of them, so to speak. And their body is present, but their soul isn't. And so I found often that members of these communities that I studied identified some of these forms of alienation. They would go to a church and they would feel like I don't I don't have a place in this church, so I don't want to be part of it. But I want to be faithful. I want to follow Christ. And so what happens is then they start to seek out people who also feel either powerless or aimless or normless. And as those groups start to form and coalesce, they're like, hey, have you been thinking about this? Like I've been thinking about this, and yeah, I've been. And so they start to grow in terms of commitment to creating something different. And so within evangelicalism, and I'll talk about the church first and society here second. It's very much just like, hey, it's way too individual. I go to church and I can't, you know, I I don't feel like I belong. I want something that's, community. I want something deeper. It's so shallow, right? So this sense of aimlessness and normlessness. And people would say they would go to church and they just feel like I'm going through the motions, right? They feel that self-estrangement. And so
Hmm.
they found other like-minded people to say, wait a second, let's be in community together where it's not shallow. It's very deep. It's so deep, it's countercultural. It's nothing like we've seen before. And so that alienation can lead to, intentional community formation, not only from the church, but also society at large. And this was particularly more true for the community Berea than it was for the community of Philadelphia. Bereans often talked about how they felt estranged from society. They didn't feel as though there was a place. They felt there's a if you've heard of the Parish Collective and Matt Soren's, he talks about in his books living above place, right? And so they felt like that's what society was. They were living above place. They wanted to be rooted and grounded in some
Hmm.
geography, and they wanted to have that community that they couldn't find in the suburbs, so they couldn't find in their neighborhoods. And so yeah, you hear, with Berea, the stories of like people just kind of like, I don't vote. I don't care about voting, because it, uh, it just is, I'm so alienated, and powerless. I don't care, but I can control where I live. I can control the people I live with and the intentionality of living with people in a spot. So that's how alienation, not only from the church but also from society at large, has really fed intentional community formation.
So, can you talk more then about getting to the two communities that you write about, their brief history and
Yeah.
background, some key things about each one?
Yeah, so Philadelphia is a community again that was started in 2007, and I started hanging around them in 2011 and 2012. And they were a community that formed out of a suburban evangelical.
Wait, where are these communities located?
Yeah, so technically I can't say.
Oh,
I think I use the because it's all pseudonyms in a Midwest city. Uh, so, but these two communities were 6 miles apart. I mean, they were both in the same city, and so geographically very similar. But Philadelphia, which again is a pseudonym, they came from a suburban Bible study, and there was four guys living together, and they said, "Hey, we want to have a community." And so more and more people started coming to the Bible study. They lived in a neighborhood of this Midwestern industrial city. that was it was probably about 10 blocks by 10 blocks. It was a relatively small neighborhood. And they just started building more and more, well, they started renting more and more apartments in that neighborhood from that Bible study. And eventually that grew into its own 503 CB or C, oh golly, whatever the technical term for nonprofit is. Um, and they started putting rules around who could be in the community and what was the rules being part of the community and who was outside the community. By the time I got to Philadelphia, there were about 40 people. There's only two or three families uh, who had children. I think there's only two families with children. One family was expecting a child. But the rest, the other 35 or so, were young adults, late teens, early 20s, many of whom had dropped out of college to be part of the community. And they were buying up houses in that neighborhood and housing people together. And that community is what we call a common purse community. They shared everything. So um, all possessions were open down to underwear. You shared underwear. Nobody had rights to clothes. Um, and so everybody in that community had to work 40 hours. A lot of people worked at Starbucks because they could work in the morning shift. They can get insurance, medical health insurance, and then they can be in the community for the rest of the day. Um, but if you didn't have a job, if you didn't have a 40-hour job, 40-hour a week job, you worked for the community. And the community had a couple of businesses, a lawn care business, a construction business, or you were praying 40 hours a week. So you had to have something going on for 40 hours in terms of work. Um, and again, they were pooling all their money together. So everybody had all their bills paid. If you showed up to the community and joined the community and you had a car, let's say you had a car payment, the community now paid that car payment. If you had debt, um, the community would pay part of that debt. Telephone, community paid for the telephone. Everybody received $100 in a month for allowance. So you can use that however you wanted to. If you wanted to go get coffee, you'd get a little debit card and you can go get coffee. You could buy gifts with that. But if you bought something for yourself, let's say you bought a shirt, that is still part of community. So anybody could wear that shirt. Gifts, if your parents sent you a gas card, that's part of the community now. So very much, again, very countercultural, particularly around these 20 somethings. They were also connected, with Philadelphia. So they started out of this Bible study, but they were also connected with the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And so very much part of the charismatic movement. So talked lots about prophecy, talked lots about kind of the Holy Spirit and where is the Holy Spirit impressing on us now to do or to go. So that was another significant part of that community. Berea, which was 6 miles away, they were located in um, independent city that was actually surrounded by the larger industrial city, Midwest industrial city. But they were in this independent city that had experienced a lot of decay. And this city was uh, basically was a lower class to lower middle class Appalachian community. And Berea moved intentionally into that city to create a ministry for individuals there who lived there. And so they moved into the neighborhood called West Sharpsburg. And the the community itself started as a church plant in 1993, so it's a little bit older. And they went through a intentional community phase in the 2000s. So they bought at that time a deconsecrated Catholic church called St. Seton, and they moved into the parish house there at an intentional community, and that kind of receded. And then by the time I got there in 2010, that had expanded again. And so there was a community that was living in the parish house. There was in the monastery, there was a urban retreat center. And then members of Berea lived, again, I think 95% of them lived within 3 blocks of each other, right around St. Seton, which is kind of the center of their community. And they were not a common purse community, so members had their own property. Even if you were in the common house, you had your own property. You just lived together in kind of a co-housing arrangement. But they were very intentional to set up community times together. They would have every Friday a meal for the entire West Sharpsburg neighborhood. They worshiped together in St. Seton, and cared for each other very much. They always knew what was going on with one another because, again, they were living so close and so intentionally. It wasn't a private life. So there was much more of an intentional association compared to a common purse.
So how did they do economic sharing? Was it more traditional, like you pay 10% for a tithe, or what?
Yeah, so even there was, very, very much like a church, which is, hey, you give what you can. We're not going to. There was a set of expectations that if you were a member of Berea, you live into, but there was very little enforcement of those expectations. There's a very lenient community. But yeah, I mean, most people, because they had committed so much to Berea already by moving into that neighborhood. Again, it was a lower socioeconomic neighborhood, so they're committing to moving from the suburbs, into that neighborhood, and very much taking care of the homes that were falling apart and investing in their homes. They had mortgages there, so it was hard for them to leave the community because they would have to sell their home, probably not much profit. And so there was, because of that economic piece, they very much maintained their participation in the community. But sharing was it was intentional in the sense of, like, if I needed to borrow a lawnmower, I would go down the street and say, hey, Henry, do you mind if I borrow your lawnmower? And so Henry would be like, yeah, everybody can borrow my lawnmower. So if, there was like 2 lawnmowers in the entire community, because they could just go get Henry's lawnmower or get Nicholas's lawnmower to mow the lawns. If you needed help with moving, I mean, the whole community was on that. They were there. They were helping you move. They were participating. One of the unique things about Berea is that the community supported 2 parish farmers. And so, and by supporting, I mean like subsistence type of wages. We're talking like just enough to get by. But this West Sharpsburg used to be a number of farms dating back over 100 years, number of farms and orchards. And so these parish farmers, they found pear trees that were part of that orchard in people's backyards, and they would work with the owners of that residence to harvest the pears. Then they convinced the city to give them part of a park to create a community garden in. At that park, they found wild grapes that were part of a vineyard that had been there 100 years ago. I mean, so it was really interesting. And so they would gather up this food, they would farm different people's lots, and then they would have nights, typically once a week during the summer, where whatever they had harvested, they would give back to the community for free. So the community would come and they would get um, food that was harvested from the neighborhood, healthy food. And it's important to note that this neighborhood is considered a food desert. There's no, viable grocery store within
Mm.
walking distance. So they saw that as part of their ministry to the neighborhood.
And you write about religious agency, charisma, and authority. How do
Yeah,
you see that played out in these two communities?
yeah, very differently, very differently. So Philadelphia, and one of the things before I go into talking about charisma in Philadelphia and authority, you do have to understand that this was a group of mostly young 20 somethings, male and female, living very close to one another. And they were very, very purposeful to prevent any sort of sexual misconduct that might happen there, just like a university does in the dorms. Like a Christian liberal arts university like Whitworth University, at 10 o'clock. That's when males and females are separated, nothing over 10, right? And and so they were very focused on that quite a bit because of how many young individuals were in the community. So consequently, there was a lot of authority um, that had to be heavy-handed at times. Um, and the people in charge were Stephen and Paul. And I think they were 20, 22, 23. I mean, these are young individuals. And there's a backstory about how, like, when they started the community, there was an older individual who was kind of discipling Stephen and Paul, and the older individual tried to kick them out at one point, but they rallied everybody in the community and they kicked out the older individual. And so there was like the coup attempt, and so that solidified Stephen and Paul's authority to set these very rigid boundaries, very strict boundaries. Now, the other thing that helped is what we would consider in sociology charisms, these otherworldly abilities. So, for example, when members talked about Paul, he was always known as the person who could pray and the prayers would come true, right?
Mm.
Stephen, prophecy. He had this gift of prophecy. He could see through by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the future of the community. And so these charisms gave a charismatic power to Stephen and Paul. And as people identified these charisms to Stephen and Paul, they allowed them to have that authority. They saw them as chosen to lead the community, even though some of the individuals grew up with them, like went to elementary school and played with them on the playground, and by the time they got to the community, it was, oh, they are gifted, right? They are chosen to be our leaders, um, and and so that you know allowed Stephen and Paul to really be unquestioned in their authority, and so they were very strict. Now I'll go into a minute here about, well, I'll tell you a story and then I'll go into kind of how strictness supports vitality. So kind of how strict were they? So one of my favorite stories comes from a member of Philadelphia named Miriam. And Miriam joined the community while it was still a Bible study. She'd been there for a while. And she was 24, 25 when I interviewed her. And she talked about how one night she fell asleep cuddling a male member of the community. And they were alone in this room and they just fell asleep cuddling. Nobody saw them, nobody knew about it. They woke up, they separated, went their own ways. They were very, very convicted by that. And so what they decided to do was to confess, even though they didn't need to. They could have like shelved it and nobody would have known. So they went to Stephen, to Paul, and they confessed. We fell asleep cuddling together. And so Stephen and Paul said, okay, well, here's your discipline. You cannot be in the same room together for 6 months. So their worship service can't be in the same room. You got to pick days that you'll be in the worship service together. And this is a community again of 40 people, so it's not like huge. And you also, if you are in any meetings together, Stephen and Paul had to be there. And then after 6 months, we will prayerfully reconsider. And so it was a bitter, Marion described this as like it was tough to live out that, that type of discipline. 6 months not being in a room together in a community of 40, that's hard. Not talking to one another, that's hard. But of course, she frames it as ultimately it's good for me, it's good for my relationship with Jesus, and submission is important. But that's the type of strictness that was part of Philadelphia. Now, there is a lot of research on how that type of strictness, strict theology, or strict behavioral expectations actually leads to vitality, to individual staying. When an individual has to give up a lot in order to be part of a church, or in this case, a community, they want to recoup that investment. And so no matter how difficult the expectations might be, or unachievable the expectations might be, when they give up something, being in a room with somebody that you might have affection for 6 months, they want to see that pay off. Giving up all of your income to be in this community, you want to see that paid off, because if you leave the community, you're not getting any of that income back, right? So you want to get the payoff. So there are very strict churches that have highly committed people, have lots of stayers, and that's their vitality, is because they set up these expectations that when people have to give up something, abstain from something, they want to get that investment back to them somehow. So that's, I kept asking, why don't you leave? Like, I mean, if it's that hard, why don't you just leave? And she's like, well, ultimately, I think this is good for me. And my submission to Christ, as represented in submission to Paul and Stephen. And so she was very much trying to recoup that. Like, I benefit from learning about submission. And so that's kind of that idea of how strictness relates to vitality.
Yeah, interesting. And then you also talk more about in-group and out-group orientation. How does that work?
Yeah, so this was something that was present in Philadelphia. It was not present in Berea. And this comes back, I think, to some of the larger arrangements that we see on the religious landscape within the United States, and this idea of tribalism. And so the in-group, out-group dynamic has been studied for decades now. And simply this, it's that when people feel part of the in-group, when they have this loyalty to some sort of group, they want to know that they belong to that group. They're committed to that group in reference to some sort of out-group. Okay. So in the case of Philadelphia, this is 2012, right? So this is, kind of in that midst of Iraq, Afghanistan. There was a lot of talk about we aren't them, right? We aren't Muslims. Right? We're not like Islamic fundamentalists. A lot of very intentional talk about that. And remember, this is a group of 40 people living in this Midwestern city who've never probably traveled to any sort of, Islamic country, right? Or have very little interactions with Islamic individuals. And yet they kept talking about that. and they had a guest speaker come in, and I was blown away by this when the very first words the guest speaker said, and this guest speaker was from England, and it was part of that um, uh, International House of Prayer network. But the guest speaker said, "You know what's wrong with our society?" He said, "Muslims." And it's like, what? Like, where is this coming from? Other than what it does is it directs individuals in that community to be like, yeah, we're not like them, right? We're something different, and you need to be committed to that difference. Because if you're anything like anybody else, you're not part of our group, right? And that helps understand like this idea of tribalism, right? If you think anything different, then you're not part of our group. And you've invested so much of your life into our group. Why would you give that up? So, on one hand, you had that out group. The other out group were very vague, but other Christians. They wouldn't necessarily name that other, right? They wouldn't say, oh, Episcopalians or Methodists or even mainline. It was just other Christians. Um, so that could include other evangelical Christians as well. But they would often talk about we're not like other Christians, right? And so what that does is that sets these other Christ followers up as the out group, and you commit to our group because you're not like them, and you invest yourself into our group, and you want to recoup those investments not by going back to the groups we came from, but by staying with us. Right? So that in-group, out-group dynamic is very much part of vitality as well.
So that must have come up in one way or another at Berea. They must have been aware of that dynamic and decided we're not going to go there. So they had some intentionality about that?
Yeah, they were very, Philadelphia was on one end of a strictness spectrum, and they were at the far end of strictness. Berea was at the lenient end. They had a set of expectations, and I would ask, what happens if somebody doesn't live into those expectations, like they don't tithe? And people are like, I don't know, we might suggest they look for something else, but we're not going to push them out. It's so very lenient. Now, what's interesting is then how does a lenient community create vitality, right? And for Berea, there was a charismatic element. The charisma wasn't in the individual, wasn't in Nicholas, who was the pastor. It was in the building. It was in the neighborhood, which is, academically, that's where I had the most critique, is by saying, hey, the charisma for Berea was in this beautiful but broken building. It was a decaying Catholic church. It was gorgeous, but you had water damage, you had plaster falling. It wasn't heated, it wasn't cooled. So if you're in the summer, you're sweating through a worship service. If you're in the winter, you were bundled up in winter jackets and you can see your breath. But that was their totem. Emil Durkheim, who brought up some of these ideas of charisma and how do we think about religion, and he argued that religion very much is a worship of its own society, and they use totems to do that. Well, here's this totem, this church that was very much the center of the community's charisma, and the neighborhood. People wanted that place. They wanted to have. These were individuals who were alienated because they felt like they had lived above place. So now they want to be committed to a place, to a plot of ground, in those 3 blocks in West Sharpsburg. So that was really where their vitality was centered. Consequently, because their vitality was centered on the place, on on St. Seton, and what it represented for their community, they didn't have to be strict. They could be pretty lenient, because they found vitality within that local ecology, or what I call the parish consciousness for them. And the other thing is they didn't have as many 20 somethings. They had a much wider
I was
range.
going to ask about
Yeah,
that. I got the impression that they were more diverse in
they were
age.
diverse. Yeah. Mhm.
All right. So, in your conclusion, you're writing about, you summarize the structural, organizational, and individual conditions that affect the vitality in these two communities. So, how did you sum those up?
Yeah. So with Philadelphia, right, you do have, obviously, as we mentioned, kind of this cultural in-group, out-group dynamic. You have strictness. But what's really interesting about Philadelphia, and I write about this in the book. This is probably my favorite scene in the book. Even though it's funny when people read the book and they read about Philadelphia and they're like, "Oh, those are, you know, I would not want to be part of Philadelphia." It's like, well, I get that, but understand like there's also these beautiful parts. So this is my favorite part that I write about in the book. So Philadelphia, during the worship services, would have a worship style called harp and bowl, which was adopted from the International House of Prayer worship style. And it is what we call antiphonal singing. So the band would be playing some sort of repeated riff, right? Set of chords. And then everybody else would be singing their own lyrics. And sometimes you'd hear people speaking in tongues because they honored that type of um, theology. You had people who would just be saying Jesus, 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 Jesus over and over, like in some sort of chant. Um, Other people might be singing the words to the actual song. But there's a point where I uh, closed my eyes during one of these worship services, um, and I just sat there and I just listened, and it was beautiful, and I was moved to tears because of how beautiful that antiphonal singing was with the band, and I could just see like people getting into what, again, Emil Durkheim, who was a sociologist, talked about the collective effervescence, this kind of like feeling of collectivity and everybody's together. And yet, what's so interesting about Harp and Bowl is that it's individuals saying their own things, right? So it's this collective yet individuated form of faith expression. And I think that goes back to some of those, when we talk about the structural, organizational, and individual aspects, that Philadelphia was a very individuated community. They were strict organizationally, but people could express freely their own commitments to Jesus in the worship, in the community, as long as it jived with everything else, with the boundaries of the community. And so there was this. Uh, it really captured, I think, at that time how young adults were thinking about religion, individuated but yet very much connected to a community, and they stayed with the community because of how strict it was. So those are some of the things that were happening there with Philadelphia. With Berea, um, it was really much about the place. Matter of fact, I even asked, one of the questions I asked to people was, how could you ever see yourself moving? And I asked this to both Philadelphia and to Berea. And Philadelphians were always like, yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe a couple weren't, but most of them are like, yeah, it's this neighborhood, whatever. We're going to take it over. Our whole community is going to own this whole neighborhood. That was kind of their prophecy. But yeah, we can leave. With Berea, it was like, no. I mean, maybe again, one or two people said, yeah, we could leave. But most people are like, we can't. Like, that is where we are called to. And we are called not just to worship here, but to live here, to recreate here, to work here. So Berea had a lot of businesses that were started and were operating out of West Sharpsburg because they had this, again, this what I call parish consciousness. Their theology was grounded in the actual space itself. And they saw St. Seton as this beautiful picture of the crucifixion of this church that's dying, and yet they were there to resurrect. the neighborhood, not in a kind of colonial sense of we're here to keep the neighborhood, to gentrify the neighborhood. They were very aware that they kind of fell on that line of, are we gentrifying or not? But it was more of a, we're here to resurrect the things that make this neighborhood so great, such as those pear trees or those wild grapes, or the community coming together on a Friday night and whatever they can share, and give to one another, whether it's Kraft macaroni and cheese or tamales. Great, let's bring it and let's eat together and be together. So, very different way of thinking about vitality, but effective. It's very effective for Berea.
So, with all your experience as a church planter and a pastor and a sociologist, all this research, what would you say to churches today, to the church today, in terms of how to encourage authentic spiritual religious vitality?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and what I tell churches, and I work with different churches through our Office of Church Engagement here, is to, number one, really flesh out, have the Holy Spirit guide you in terms of what is the church's mission. And I think that's really important to note, because often, when I talk to a church that is getting older, right, is really fearful of shutting down, and they're also not willing to be like, oh, I want to, or I should say they're timid in terms of saying, we want to get young people in here. And what I say is, yeah, you don't have to get young people into the church. I mean, there are different forms of vitality. It's not just about the joining, but you have to be very intentional about what God is calling that church to. So if you're a church of, 50 somethings, okay, great. What is God calling 50 somethings to do right now? Because living out that mission, right, will help keep people committed to that church. Right? As they invest themselves into the mission, people will stay, or people will hear about the mission of the church and will come and join the church. So it really does, I think, first start with mission. What is the church called to? And then from there, I think churches do need to be very intentional about strategies. Now, I'm not saying go out and start branding your church. I'm not saying that. That's only one form of strategy. But I was working with the church that is a Presbyterian church, and they had a history where their primary, the primary growth happened around the baby boom. And then kind of since the 80s have been slowly dying away, having what I call natural attrition in the congregation. And now they're about 50 people, where once they were 300. And so this church is like, okay, what do we do? Right? We live in many different parts of the city because those who are committed drive into the church. And I said, what's your church's mission? And their mission was pretty generic. So they didn't quite have an idea of where they were being called to, or what they were being called to do. And they did have some resources dedicated to parish farming. And so they had a guy who was doing some of that kind of on the side as a ministry of the church. And it's like, okay, well, think about like where God was working with the ministry is called Growing Neighbors. Think about where God is working with Growing Neighbors, and could that be more of what this church is being called to do? And so there was some hemming and hawing, like we don't know, like that, and so they kind of hemmed and hawed, and they said, you know what, I don't think we're going to do this anymore. And my sense was that they didn't want to think about strategy in that sense. I wasn't saying go out and, get a bunch of coffee mugs and t-shirts and brand yourself. I was saying, hey, where's God calling you to? And what is your mission? And there was this reticence, almost like God's going to save us. God's going to save us. And maybe the church will have a revival. I'm not saying the Holy Spirit can't do that at all. I'm just saying that if that's the case, it'd be really, really rare. It'd be an exception for sure. So I think that's the thing. Those are kind of the two things: is think about what you're called to do, authentically called to do, and then be strategic in terms of living out that mission.
Well, I really appreciate your perspective as a church planter, pastor, sociologist, that you're seeing this from the, very concrete way, but also a more theoretical and studied way. So thank you so much for your time. I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been looking at intentional Christian community with Dr. Mark Killian. So check out his book. Follow the link below. It's Religious Vitality in Christian Intentional Communities, a comparative ethnographic study, excuse me. All righty. So, Mark, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks for having me.
All right. Peace to everyone. Please check out more videos from The Charge. Don't forget to click on like and hit the subscribe button.